That is the most astoundingly dangerous doctrine ever proposed by an administration. And although the administration has not as yet gotten away with that kind of bold doctrine, we have seen developments put in place that amount to a blueprint for a potential dictatorship in the name of national security. I have arguments with my Republican friends all the time about this, and their defense usually comes back to, well, George Bush and his people are reasonable policymakers. They're not going to abuse this power. It'd be hard to imagine anything that would be a greater contrast to the attitude of the founders of this country, who always wanted to box in power, to restrain it, because they didn't trust people to be reasonable. They understood human nature. People who defend this kind of power grab by the Bush administration obviously do not understand human nature. I often bring them to an abrupt halt by saying, well, okay, let me concede your point that George Bush and his people are all very reasonable individuals and who never, ever, ever think of abusing this power. Let's, for the sake of argument, accept that. How comfortable do you feel trusting that same power to Hillary Clinton and Jamie Gorlock and the people who will populate that administration someday? And the response I get is akin to a deer in the headlights. It's like they have never thought of this. I guess they assume that their political faction will always run the mechanisms of governmental power, so they don't need to worry. All I can say is that kind of power in the hands of Hillary, be afraid, be very afraid. Being the bully of the playground certainly has not increased the scope of America's freedom. Quite the contrary, it has greatly reduced it. And it also has not made America any more secure. Indeed, again, the exact opposite effect. 9/11 should have demonstrated the reality of blowback even to the Rudy Giulianis of the world. Bullying produces inevitable blowback, and we have seen it again and again. We saw it in Iran following the Islamic Revolution. We now have an arch enemy of the United States for nearly 3 decades and no end in sight. Blowback, as I said, is inevitable. In an article that I published in January of 1997, I warned that if the United States did not change its foreign policy, particularly in the Muslim world, it was only a matter of time before we would have major terrorist incidents in the United States. Unfortunately, that article sank like a stone. The mainstream media was monumentally uninterested in it, and even though this was written as part of a policy handbook for members of Congress, I did not get a response from a single member of that august body. But of course, in September of 2001, that prediction came all too true. If our bullying foreign policy is not changed, and soon, it will spell the death knell for America's reputation abroad and for its liberty and safety at home. Unfortunately, even if we change that policy tomorrow, even if the reincarnation of Thomas Jefferson were elected president in the year 2008 and made a 180-degree change in our foreign policy, it will take decades to repair all the damage that has been done. We can regain the trust of the rest of the world and the admiration of the rest of the world. But we have to take that first step to repudiate the kind of foreign policy that has made so many enemies. And we will. And we're also going to have to be patient, because I think for most people, even if we should proclaim a change in our foreign policy, they in effect are going to be from Missouri. They're going to have to be shown. But just as the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, we need to take that first step to drastically change our foreign policy and be a good global citizen, not the bully of the global playground. Thank you. I'm interested in exploring any of the points that I raised in greater detail if you'd like me to do that. Also, if there are things that you felt I should have touched on that I didn't, this is the time to bring those up, and I'll be very happy to address those issues as well. Yes?
Mr. Carpenter, I was very interested in your recounting of the abuses of the Iranian citizens that have been laid at our doorstep. How do you account for what seems to be today a relatively positive view of Americans by the reformers in Iran?
Well, it's interesting because among younger Iranians, there certainly is a less negative attitude toward the United States than you find in most other countries in the Muslim world. And I think the short answer to that is that these people have experienced the oppression of the clerical regime of the mullahs, who keep saying they hate the United States. And I think the reaction of a lot of Iranians is, if this lousy regime hates the United States, then the U.S. really can't be all that bad. Whereas other Muslim societies have experienced the direct or indirect oppression fostered by the United States, and therefore their attitudes toward Washington are far more negative. I think if we don't screw things up, within a decade and a half, we're likely to have a significantly different kind of government in Iran. The mullahs have pretty well used up all the revolutionary fervor that the Iranian people had. And now they are regarded as just a dour, repressive, corrupt, and economically illiterate regime. The way the United States could screw that up, and we seem to be right on the verge of doing that, is to do what George Bush has just apparently signed off on, and that is to authorize a covert action program to undermine the Iranian government. What you find is that although you find a segment, particularly among younger Iranians, that are very secular, very pro-American, there are millions of Iranians who are in the middle. They may not particularly like the current regime, but they're also not especially fond of the United States either. And if evidence emerges that we are once again meddling in Iran's internal affairs, that faction is likely to move into the pro-government camp rather than moving into the camp of the anti-government faction. So again, if we have a hands-off policy, I think we would likely be favorably impressed by the probable results 10 or 15 years from now. But we could certainly change that outcome for the worse very, very easily. And we seem, with our current leaders, to be on the path to doing that. Yes, over here.
Tim Kelly of Woodbridge, Virginia.